Welcome back. This is the second segment in our analysis of the timeline of Jesus' birth, and the fifth video in our series, Chronology in the Life of Jesus. In this video, we're going to tackle the question, when was the death of Herod the Great? It's highly relevant to our analysis because the Gospel of Matthew tells us that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Thus, if we can figure out when Herod died, that would give us a latest possible date for Jesus' birth. This question has been the point of shipwreck of countless attempts to determine when Jesus was born. The textbook answer, assumed by many, is that Herod died in March of 4 BC. Check Google, that's what it will tell you. It turns out, if you dive a little deeper into the evidence, there are some big question marks surrounding the March of 4 BC date. In this video, we're going to examine the evidence from our most detailed source, Flavius Josephus. We're going to look at the popular surer hypothesis and the shortcomings of that hypothesis, and then we will work through the data and plot on a timeline the earliest and latest possible dates of Herod's death. Our most detailed source comes from Flavius Josephus because he had access to the work of Nicholas of Damascus, a confidant of Herod. Josephus provides us several very relevant details regarding Herod's death. He tells us when Herod's reign began. He tells us that 3 years later, Herod conquered Jerusalem. That is, essentially, he was a king without a kingdom for 3 years until the Romans helped him capture Jerusalem. He tells us that Herod reigned 37 years after he was appointed by the Romans, and he tells us he reigned 34 years after his conquest of Jerusalem. So he tells us when Herod's reign begins and how long he reigned. That should get us in the right ballpark for when he died, right? With ancient chronology, it's helpful to have more fixed points if possible, and Josephus does give us one extremely valuable data point. He recounts in detail the events just before and just after Herod's death, and he tells us that just before Herod's death, there was a lunar eclipse. He gives us a lot of details about what happened between that eclipse and Herod's death, and what happened between Herod's death and the subsequent Passover. Herod died during an interval between a lunar eclipse and Passover. This information is exceptionally useful because astronomically we can calculate when there were lunar eclipses visible from Judea, and it turns out there are 5 eclipses that are roughly in the right ballpark that we're looking for. 2 in 5 BC, 1 in 4 BC, and 2 in 1 BC. This then is the set of data we have to work with. Which of these eclipses was mentioned by Josephus when he told us that there was an eclipse just before Herod's death? Well, let's take a look at what Josephus tells us about when Herod's reign began. Josephus tells us of Herod's appointment by the Romans and dates it 2 different ways. Unfortunately, his dates conflict with each other. This happens several times in Josephus. He gives us the Olympiad date, and he tells us who the Roman consuls were. The problem is there was no point during which that Olympiad date overlapped with those consuls. So some people read Josephus and say, we think he's referring to 40 BC. Others read Josephus and say, no, we think he means 39 BC. 2 possibilities here for when Herod was appointed. Josephus also tells us, and we do have independent attestation, that it was 3 years after his appointment that he conquered Jerusalem with the aid of the Romans. Josephus also dates this 2 ways, and once again his dates conflict with each other. He gives us the consuls of the year, which are the consuls for 37 BC, and he tells us that Herod conquered Jerusalem 27 years after Pompey conquered Jerusalem. Well, this is helpful. We know when Pompey's conquest of Jerusalem was. That's fairly well established. It was 63 BC. Okay, fast forward 27 years, that gets you to 36 BC. Here then we have the 2 possibilities for the conquest of Jerusalem. Since we have multiple attestations suggesting these events were 3 years apart, that leaves us with 2 possibilities. Possibility A, Herod is appointed in 40 BC and conquers Jerusalem in 37, or possibility B, Herod is appointed in 39 and conquers Jerusalem in 36. We'll come back to these dates several times in our effort to answer the question, which of these eclipses does Josephus have in mind? In doing so, we'll use the length of Herod's reign provided by Josephus. He tells us that Herod reigned 37 years from his appointment by Rome and 34 years from his conquest of Jerusalem. Now, some will immediately notice, wait a minute, there's going to be a problem getting the math to work. If you do 40 minus 37 or 39 minus 37, you don't get any of these years. We're going to have to go into a little bit more detail about how Herod's reign was reckoned, but here's our starting point. We have from Josephus the eclipse, 5 possibilities. Herod's appointment by Rome and his conquest of Jerusalem, 2 possibilities each, and the length of Herod's reign. These are the data points we will use to construct our chronology.